There are stories that echo quietly through the edges of history. Stories that never made it to the books children read in school. Stories whispered in low voices, passed from one generation to the next, not for entertainment, but for warning. And sometimes a story survives not because it's written, but because it refuses to be forgotten. The winds off the western coast of Scotland have carried many things. Salt, rain, and the cold silence of places long untouched. But centuries ago, those winds carried something else, rumors. At first, just murmurs. A traveler never reaching his destination. A horse found wandering, reins dragging in the mud. A coach overturned, the luggage intact, but no sign of the passengers. There were explanations, of course. Bandits. Weather. Bad luck. People disappeared in those times. It wasn't uncommon. But then came the patterns. Couples. Small families. Always on the move. Always on foot or by cart, always vanishing without a trace, no blood, no struggle, no cries reported by passers-by. They simply ceased to exist. Villages along the coast grew cautious. Paths once well-traveled were avoided. Inns stood half empty. There were fewer merchants on the road, fewer carriages on the dirt paths between towns. Yet no one spoke aloud what many were beginning to suspect. Because whatever it wasn't being seen. It was being hidden. The land around Ballantrae, rugged and harsh, held secrets in its crags and cliffs. The sea battered the coastline, tearing at the rock face like it was trying to unearth something buried deep inside. But the earth didn't give up its answers so easily. The disappearances continued. Not in clusters, but in rhythm. Enough to be noticed. Never enough to be confirmed. Until one day, a man survived. No one was prepared for what he would say. And no one believed him, not at first. The details were too strange. Too horrific. But when his story led others to a certain place, a place no one had dared to search, those doubts began to fade. Quickly. And what was found was unlike anything recorded in Scotland's long and bloody history. This is not a story of war. It's not a tale of kingdoms or kings. It's not one of politics, nor of conquest. This is a story about absence. About the places where no one looks. The cracks in the land, and in the mind. It is about what grows in silence when no one dares to ask questions. And about the family that thrived in that silence. The name Sornabeen has been passed through time with a mix of disbelief and dread. Some say he never existed. Others are not so sure. But we're not here to decide what's true. We're here to lay it all bare. The names. The numbers. The cave. The claims. And what was left behind. Because once the truth was uncovered, there was no going back. And for hundreds of years no one has ever walked the roads near Ballantrae the same way again. Long before the name Sornabeen ever passed between lips, long before any record hinted at what might have happened, the land was already shaping the story. The southwestern coast of Scotland, rough, isolated, untamed. This was no place for comfort. The soil was rocky. The sea violent. Villages were small, scattered, and tired. Most people worked the land because there was nothing else to do. They toiled by day, locked their doors by night, and trusted few beyond their family's blood. This was not a time of safety. Justice, if it came at all, came slowly. Word traveled by foot or by hoof, and the law followed even slower. Entire families could vanish before their names were written in ink. These were the margins of the kingdom. What happened here rarely reached the ears of the crown. And this was the world Alexander Bean was born into. Some say it was East Lothian. Others say further south. But where he came from matters less than where he chose to go. The man who would later be known as Sornay wasn't cast out. He wasn't chased by fire or sword. He left of his own will. Walked away from work, from kin, from what passed for structure. Not out of rebellion. Not out of protest. Simply because the edges called to him. he didn't go alone. With him was a woman. Fierce in temperament. Sharp in tongue. They say her name was Agnes. Some say more than that. That she too had left behind a life marked by violence. That people in her village whispered things long before she disappeared. Together they vanished into the landscape. Further and further west, where the cliffs met the sea, and the roads turned to trails, then to nothing. They found a cave. Deep, hidden, swallowed by the tide at high water. And they stepped inside. No taxes. No rules. No witnesses. The cave would become home. Not just for them, but for what they would create. In the space between darkness and firelight, a new kind of life took root. A life without the sound of bells or markets. A life where the forest spoke louder than men. Where no laws mattered. Where no eyes watched. And as the years passed, the cave began to fill. Children were born. And then more. But there were no neighbors. No community. No boundaries. Just one bloodline, twisting in on itself, shaped by isolation and need. A generation raised not by the world outside, but by hunger, secrecy, and silence. Most families passed down stories. Lessons. Names. This one passed down instincts. By the time the first signs reached the outside, missing travelers, broken wagons, empty saddles, the cave was already full. Full of bodies. Full of knowledge learned in darkness. Full of people who had never once been told that what they were doing was wrong. And the land, cold and quiet as ever, said nothing. For over 2 decades, that cave would remain untouched. No one approached it. No one thought to search. Even when the missing became too many to ignore, the truth remained out of reach. Not because it was hidden well, but because no one dared imagine what might be hiding in a place so forgotten. But it was there. And every night, the waves washed up to its mouth, then slipped away as if trying to take the secret with them. The mouth of the cave wasn't wide. It didn't beckon. It didn't offer shelter in the traditional sense. At high tide, it vanished completely beneath the sea. But at low tide, it opened up, long, narrow, stretching back further than most would dare to walk. No one knows how they found it. Whether it was chance, or choice. But once inside, they stayed. The air was thick. Damp. The ceiling low in places. Walls marked by centuries of erosion, carved slowly by water and wind. But further in, it widened. Enough to build fires. Enough to lay down hides. Enough to make a life invisible to anyone standing just feet away. In that place where no light reached, the days were not measured by the sun. Time was kept by hunger. By growth. By need. The man and the woman, Sorne and Agnes, had children. Some say 6. Others say 8. But the numbers would mean little soon enough. Because the children grew up together. And as they grew older, more were born. Not from outsiders. There were none. Only from each other. The cave had no rules. No customs. No shame. Only survival. And when there was no food, when roots and game failed them, they didn't return to the towns. They didn't beg. They watched the roads instead. The ones who traveled alone. Or in twos. The ones no one would miss quickly. They followed them. Marked their paths. Waited for places where the road bent just far enough from view. Then they acted. The bodies were never left behind. That was the rule. Nothing was wasted. Flesh was stripped, organs taken. Bones thrown into pits that deepened with every passing year. Clothing, jewelry, coin, all brought back to the cave. Every item stored. Every piece kept. A collection that told a story few would ever live long enough to repeat. The cave absorbed it all. The sounds. The smells. The remains. A world within a world, expanding in silence. And as the clan grew, so did its hunger. Soon, they weren't just watching the roads. They were covering them, coordinating attacks, moving like one body made of many parts. A system. A network. Generations raised without a word from the outside, operating with precision shaped only by time and repetition. No one knew how many they killed. Estimates change. Numbers were never written down. But there is one detail that remains consistent across every account, whispered from century to century. It wasn't just the killing that disturbed those who eventually found them. It was how ordinary it all looked. They didn't live in chaos. They didn't live in madness. They lived with structure. A family unit. Roles were assigned. Responsibilities divided. Food shared, tools crafted. They were not wild. They were disciplined. And that was what made the truth harder to look at. Because when the walls of that cave were finally seen by men from the outside, it wasn't just bones they found. It was a system. Built with patience. Sustained by blood. Hidden in plain silence. And all the while, just beyond the mouth of that cave, the ocean continued to crash against the rocks again and again. But it never washed anything away. No records exist for when the first victim vanished. No date. No name. No account of their face, or where they had been heading. All that's known is that they were missed. And then someone else was missed. And then another. There were gaps in memory. Journeys that were never completed. Markets expecting deliveries that never came. Loved ones waiting at doors that were never knocked on. The villagers closest to the coast began to notice. But nothing was said, not at first. Disappearances were part of life. The land took people. Rivers flooded. Roads gave way. Bandits roamed. Nothing stayed still for long. But these were different. These weren't just losses, they were absences. No horses returned. No wreckage was found. Nothing washed ashore. Just silence and space where people had once been. When the pieces did surface and when items were found weeks later in places they should not have been, there were no answers. Only suspicion. Only questions met with more questions. Still, the pattern was ignored. Not from denial, but from fear. Because to acknowledge that something was moving out there, something with an intent, meant confronting the idea that it could not be stopped. And so the road remained open. What happened next was not a sudden change. It was slow, meticulous. The disappearances continued, spaced just far enough apart to feel unrelated. A man traveling alone to collect debts. A woman heading to visit her sister. A merchant on his return from air. All different lives. All ending in the same place. Inside the cave, the Bing clan was efficient. Bodies were brought back in full. Cut cleanly. Flesh separated into portions. Blood drained. Bones stacked in corners, sometimes broken for marrow, sometimes split for kindling. Clothing sorted. Gold melted. Tools sharpened. This was not savagery. It was routine. The young ones participated early. They learned not by instruction, but by repetition. They were never told to be cruel. They were taught to be thorough. In their world, there was no cruelty. There was only use. Every resource was finite, except the people outside. Sometimes, what returned to the cave was not a body. Sometimes it was still breathing. Sometimes it screamed. But not for long. The story suggests that those who were brought back alive were not treated differently. There were no rituals. No long games. Just silence. Then work. And when it was done, the cave went quiet again. Some say there were over 1,000 victims. Some say less. Others claim no such number could ever be known. But even one would have been enough to mark that cave forever. In the villages nearby, explanations began to thin. Horses were found galloping alone, their saddles stained. Cartwheels snapped in places where the road was flat. People started turning around before nightfall. They stopped helping strangers on the road. They stopped asking questions. But the beans did not stop. They didn't slow. They didn't slip. There were no mistakes. No bodies left behind. No trail of evidence. Until one night, there was. For years, they moved in shadow. Their world stayed intact. Their hands stayed full. Their names remained unknown. And then one night, it unraveled. It began like the others. A man and his wife, traveling by horse. A quiet road. No towns for miles. A slow ride home under grey skies. They were used to the silence. Trusted it. There was no fear in their movement. But they were being watched. From the trees, from the edge of the path, from ground worn by the feet of dozens who never returned, the Bing clan waited. This time, they acted before the travelers had dismounted. Without words. Without hesitation. They emerged as one. Rough hands. Quick cuts. Blades carried for years. But something changed. The man fought back. He didn't overpower them. He didn't win. But he didn't fall immediately, and neither did his wife. He held them off long enough. Long enough to draw blood. Long enough for noise to rise above the trees. Long enough for someone, anyone to hear. And someone did. A group returning from a nearby fair. Armed. On horseback. They saw the figures first, half visible in the fog, scattered at the edge of the road like shadows caught in the act. And then they saw the man, wounded but alive, his wife blooded but breathing. The beans had vanished by then. But not fast enough. For the first time, they'd been seen. The story traveled faster than the clan had ever moved. It reached the towns. Then the villages. Then the ears of those who had heard the whispers and done nothing. This time, silence wasn't enough. This time, names were taken. Orders were given. The king himself, James VI, is said to have heard the account. Whether from his court or his people, the result was the same. Action. A search like none before it. Over 400 men were assembled. Soldiers. Trackers. Hunters. Locals who had lost someone and never received an answer. They rode not with suspicion, but with certainty. For 3 days, they searched. Through brush, over cliff, across shallow rivers and jagged paths. They followed where no maps guided. They listened for what couldn't be heard. And then they found it. A narrow opening, half swallowed by tide. Barely visible to those who didn't know it was there. But inside, just beyond reach, they saw the first proof. The smell struck first. Then the bones. Then the piles. Skeletal remains stretched out across stone like discarded tools. Skull split clean. Limbs cracked and piled. Garments, torn and rotted. Pouches of coin. Jewelry crusted with sea salt. Men, women, children. Eyes wide in the light they weren't used to seeing. Faces that looked too similar. Flesh marked by inbreeding. Hair long, wild. Nails curled inward. They didn't speak. Not at first. Just stared. Some tried to run. Others didn't move at all. There was no resistance. There were no cries of innocence. They were pulled from the cave like roots torn from earth, piece by piece, family by family. Dozens of them. Filthy. Thin. But alive. They were taken in chains. Bound and marched through the same roads they'd once hunted. Townsfolk watched as they passed. Some screamed. Some wept. But most stood silent. Because now the missing had names. Faces. Endings. The truth had stepped out from under the rock. and it could no longer be ignored. There was no courtroom, no trial by jury, no pleas entered, no witnesses called. What was found inside the cave had already answered every question. The king's men brought them to Edinburgh, some say Glasgow. The records differ, but the accounts agree on one thing: there would be no legal proceeding, only judgment. The men were executed first. They were taken by groups, bound, limbs severed one by one, left to bleed in silence, then finished. Their bodies were burned, the ashes scattered. There would be no burial, no monument, no marker. The women and children came next. Some were hanged, others burned. The youngest were watched closely. Officials debated their fates. Blood, they said, was blood. The decision was made quickly. No member of the clan was spared. The cave, once full, stood empty. But it remained. Locals sealed the entrance with stones. Others claim it collapsed naturally. But even after it was closed, no one went near it. Fishermen avoided the coast. Children were warned away. Not because of what might still live inside, but because of what had once called it home. Years passed. Then decades. The story changed shape. Names twisted. Dates blurred. Some began to doubt it had ever happened at all. Was Sawney been real? Or just a story told to keep people indoors after dark? Was it history or myth? The official records are sparse. No surviving documents list the executions. No formal trial notes exist. And yet the details continue to echo. The matching accounts. The names. The cave. The rumors that refuse to die. Too many pieces align. Too many stories were passed down, quietly, without flourish. Perhaps the truth isn't in the papers. Perhaps it's in the silence that followed. Because after the beans were gone, the disappearances stopped. Travelers returned safely. Roads stayed quiet. And the coast, for the first time in years, was still. But there are those who say something remains. Not in the flesh. Not in form. But in the way the air still feels colder near that part of the shore. In the way the tide pulls a little harder at night. In the way animals won't linger near the rocks. They say the land doesn't forget. That it holds memory like bone holds fracture. You can't always see it, but it's there. So if you ever find yourself along the southwestern coast of Scotland, on a quiet day, with no wind, no waves, stand still. Listen. Somewhere beneath the stone. The silence might remember. If you found this story chilling, make sure to give it a like and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more real-life horror tales that will keep you up at night. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.